Question 83. Why Karl Marx regarded power as class power and as a temporary phenomenon? Discuss the main features of the Marxian theory of political obligation. Introduction. Marx's revolutionary view of power and obligation. Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, the founder of modern socialism and communism, gave a radically different understanding of power, state, and political obligation. For Marx, political institutions are not neutral instruments serving all citizens equally, they are expressions of class dominance, created to maintain the rule of one class over another. Hence, power, in his view, is class power, the organized authority of the economically dominant class to protect its interests and maintain control over the means of production. However, Marx also believed that this form of power is temporary. Once class divisions disappear and a classless, communist society is established, power, as an instrument of coercion, will wither away. Therefore, political obligation in Marxism arises not from moral duty or consent but from the economic structure of society and the class relations it produces. 1. Why Marx regarded power as class power? I. Historical materialism, the economic basis of power. Marx's theory of power is rooted in his doctrine of historical materialism, which holds that the economic structure, base, of society determines its political and legal superstructure. In every stage of history, from slavery to feudalism to capitalism, the class that controls the means of production also controls political power. Thus, political power is not autonomous, it reflects and serves the interests of the economically dominant class. Example. In feudal society, the landlords ruled because they owned land. In capitalist society, the bourgeoisie, capitalist class, rules through the state because it owns capital and industry. Hence, the state and its power exist to preserve economic inequality and class privilege. 2. The state as an instrument of class domination. For Marx, the state is not an impartial or moral institution serving all citizens, as liberal theorists claimed, like Locke or Rousseau. Instead, it is a committee for managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie. In other words, the state is the organized power of one class to oppress another. The laws, police, army, and courts all serve to protect private property and suppress working class resistance. Example, during industrial capitalism, the state passed laws to defend factory owners' rights but restricted workers' unions and strikes. Thus, power is inherently class-based, it arises from and functions for the dominant economic class. 3. Political power as an expression of economic power. Economic control translates into political dominance. Those who own the means of production also control education, media, and ideology, shaping public opinion to legitimize their rule. This process is called ideological hegemony, the ability of the ruling class to make its ideas appear as the universal truth. Hence, power operates not only through coercion, but also through consent shaped by ideology. Example, capitalist societies convince workers that private property and competition are natural and moral, thus maintaining their submission without open coercion. 4. Class power is temporary. Marx viewed history as a dialectical process, a series of class struggles leading to social transformation. Since class power is based on ownership of economic resources, it is not eternal. When the economic structure changes, the ruling class changes, and eventually, class power itself will disappear. After the working class, proletariat, overthrows the capitalist class, bourgeoisie, society will pass through two stages. 1. Socialist stage, state power remains but serves the working class, property becomes collective. 2. Communist stage, class distinctions vanish, the state and power as coercive instruments wither away. Hence, power is temporary, it will disappear when the conditions that necessitate domination and class conflict are abolished. 2. Why Marx regarded power as a temporary phenomenon. Power exists only in class society. Power, according to Marx, emerges when society is divided into classes with conflicting economic interests. Its function is to regulate and suppress conflict in favor of the dominant class. Once class divisions are eliminated, the need for coercive authority ends. Hence, power is not an eternal feature of human existence, it is historically specific to class society. 2. The withering away of the state. Marx and Engels predicted that in the final stage of communism, the state and political power would cease to exist as coercive instruments. The state would be replaced by self-governing communities managing social and economic affairs collectively. In Engels' words, the government of persons is replaced by the administration of things. Thus, political power is a transitory phenomenon, necessary only until the full establishment of social and economic equality. 3. Transition from coercion to cooperation. In the communist society, coercive political power gives way to voluntary cooperation based on equality and common ownership. There will be no need for laws enforced by force, as social harmony will arise naturally from shared interests. Therefore, power as domination will vanish, replaced by power as collective self-management. 4. End of exploitation ends the need for authority. Power exists to maintain the system of exploitation. When exploitation ends, i.e., when labor and capital are reunited under social ownership, coercive authority loses its purpose. Thus, for Marx, power is not a natural human need but a social product of inequality, destined to disappear with the rise of communism. 3 main features of the Marxian theory of political obligation. Marx's theory of political obligation departs sharply from the traditional moral and legal justifications offered by thinkers like Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. He denied that individuals owe obedience to the state because of divine command, consent, or moral duty. Instead, political obligation is explained in terms of class relations and material conditions. Economic determinism of political obligation. In Marx's view, people's sense of obligation to obey the state arises not from moral choice but from economic dependence. The ruling class controls the means of production, and thus, citizens are structurally compelled to obey the state that safeguards the economic system. Obedience, therefore, is not voluntary or moral, it is economic necessity. Example, workers must obey the laws of the capitalist state because their survival depends on the wages and property system protected by it. 2. The state serves the ruling class. Since the state represents the interests of the economically dominant class, political obligation is one-sided. The ruling class demands obedience from the oppressed classes to maintain its dominance. The oppressed obey not out of moral duty, but because the state's coercive apparatus, laws, police, army, compels them to. Thus, political obligation under capitalism is illusory, a form of false consciousness maintained through ideology. 3. Ideological control and false consciousness. The capitalist state creates a sense of false obligation among citizens by promoting the idea that laws and government serve everyone equally. In reality, this is an ideological illusion. The working class is manipulated to believe that obedience to law equals patriotism or morality, whereas it actually sustains their subordination. Political obligation, therefore, is manufactured through ideology, not moral reason. 4. Political obligation in the socialist state. After the proletarian revolution, the working class establishes a dictatorship of the proletariat, a transitional phase between capitalism and communism. In this phase, citizens owe political obligation to the new socialist state because it represents their collective interests. Unlike the bourgeois state, this state enforces laws not to exploit but to abolish exploitation. Thus, obedience becomes rational and moral, as it serves the emancipation of all. Disappearance of political obligation in communism. In the final stage, communism, when class divisions vanish, political obligation loses its meaning. There will be no coercive laws or rulers, people will voluntarily cooperate for the common good. Hence, political obligation, like the state itself, is temporary. It arises in class societies and disappears in a classless, stateless society. 6. Revolutionary duty. Marx replaces the idea of obedience with the duty to revolt against unjust systems. When the state becomes an instrument of exploitation, resistance becomes the highest form of political obligation. Thus, for Marxists, true obligation is not obedience to authority but commitment to human emancipation through revolutionary transformation. 4. Summary. For quick understanding, Marx regarded power as class power because it is rooted in the economic dominance of one class over another and serves to maintain exploitation. Power is temporary, as it will disappear with the abolition of class society and the rise of communism. The Marxian theory of political obligation holds that obedience arises from material and class conditions, not moral duty. The state is an instrument of class rule. Political obligation is imposed, not chosen. It will vanish in a classless, communist society. Hence, Marx transforms the question from "why should I obey the state?" to "why should I obey a state that perpetuates exploitation?" Quick revision notes. Power, class-based, arising from economic dominance. State, instrument of class oppression. Basis of obligation, economic compulsion, not consent. Nature, temporary, will vanish with classless society. Transition, from capitalist coercion. Revolution. Socialist. Communist cooperation. Revolution, a moral and political duty against exploitation. Goal, classless, stateless, exploitation-free society. One-line questions and answers for revision. 1. Why did Marx call power class power? Because it reflects and serves the Interests of the economically dominant class. 2. What is the ultimate goal of Marx's political philosophy? Establishment of a classless, stateless society. 3. What is the role of the state under capitalism? To protect private property and maintain class domination. 4. Why is power temporary for Marx? It exists only in class-divided societies and will vanish with communism. 5. What is false consciousness? The illusion that the state represents all classes equally. 6. What replaces the capitalist state after revolution? Dictatorship of the proletariat. 7. What happens to political obligation in communism? It disappears as coercive authority becomes unnecessary. 8. What is the true political duty of the working class, according to Marx? To overthrow oppressive systems. 9. What determines political obligation in Marxism? Economic structure and class relations. 10. What phrase did Engels use to describe the end of the state? The withering away of the state. Final connection. Karl Marx's vision transforms political theory from a question of obedience to a struggle for liberation. Power, for him, is not a moral right but an instrument of class control, one that will fade as humanity achieves economic equality and social cooperation. In the classless, communist order, the compulsion to obey will give way to voluntary cooperation, and the coercive state will dissolve into collective human freedom, the final triumph of man over domination.